the piece that I wrote, I used the example of Atlas Shrugged because of the fact that Danielle Smith has said that it's a favorite of hers. In fact, she even said the other day, maybe it should be mandatory reading in high schools. Like, it can't be both ways. There are passages in Atlas Shrugged that are, sexual in nature, and the way it's described, these encounters in the book between the main character and some of her lovers, that it would meet this definition. So the idea that it's explicit and it should be banned, but it's also valuable and should be mandatory reading, like, it can't be both, right? So yeah, the premier's been on the defensive, but I think ultimately that's partly because governments don't like to acknowledge that they screwed up. And I think in this case, the Alberta government screwed up.
The Amber Mack Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
Welcome to the Amber Mack Show. If you're curious about the chaos happening in Washington alongside America's biggest tech leaders, we have some answers for you on today's show. Plus, there's always a lot of talk about minimum wage, but maybe it's time we have a maximum wage. Jeff, you're going to talk about that this week in The Other Mac.
I sure am, and especially after hearing about Tesla's new pay package for Elon Musk. But speaking of the troller-in-chief, we're also going to talk about how the White House is trolling its workers on LinkedIn. And back here in Canada, looking forward to your conversation with a columnist and podcaster in Alberta who explains everything we need to know about that province's book ban. But first, let's dive into the headlines.
Newsfeed.
In tech news this week, American semiconductor company Broadcom appears to have landed a $10 billion deal with OpenAI to manufacture AI chips, following previous Broadcom customers, Google, Meta, and TikTok's ByteDance. Now, just to be clear, Broadcom doesn't announce the identity of these big customers publicly, but Jeff, there are only so many domestic clients that would be looking for $10 billion of its AI chips. So analysts are saying, and they're pretty confident about this assessment, and this news has also been reported by Reuters and many others.
Yeah, and it's hard not to see this as yet another move to placate President Trump's demands on the tech industry by onshoring more of that kind of production. In fact, the unprecedented relationship between the president and tech companies continued last week with what Trump called a high IQ dinner. If anyone says high IQ to describe smart, they don't have high IQ. But anyway, he had a high IQ dinner with more than a dozen tech giants, notably lacking Elon Musk, who assured everyone that he was invited, but he just had other things he had to do. But during this dinner, in what I think might be a first, and I tried to find another example of this and could not, the president was thanked by Google's CEO, Sundar Pichai, for his administration's role in resolving the government's antitrust case against Google, which wrapped up recently with Google surprisingly avoiding any real substantial penalties. And Keldon Bester, who's the executive director of the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, had this to say about it, quote, "Google dodged not only the worst punishment, but the second and third worst consequences. And the fact that the judge decided not to even ban the conduct that he saw as problematic in the illegal maintenance of a monopoly speaks to how empty this decision is."
Yeah, I mean, it does feel a little bit like the Wild West these days. And I think it's fair to say that the president shouldn't be involved directly in anything like this. So
No.
it's really another example of how he is, in many ways, intimidating some of these big tech companies during his second term. That's also not stopping the White House from doing important things, and I'm being sarcastic here, like updating their LinkedIn profile picture to Trump's headshot. When it was pointed out how unusual this move was, which basically puts Trump's face under the experience section of anyone who has ever worked at the White House. On X, formerly known as Twitter, Stephen Chung, the assistant to the president and White House director of communications, replied to someone who was skeptical about this move that, and I quote here, "That's the whole point, dummy, troll," and basically trying to troll his fellow citizens. Isn't that lovely?
Yeah, the fact that the White House is spending its time trolling people on social media says a lot about how unfit for duty this administration is. Thankfully, though, at least some politicians are finally finding some backbone to stand up to the damage being done by big tech under this president. For instance, Republican Senator Josh Hawley recently spoke about this at the National Conservatism Conference, saying that AI, and I quote, "AI is fulfilling transhumanist goals. Whatever its boosters may personally believe, And if it proceeds in this way undirected, if it proceeds in this manner unchecked, the tech barons, already the most powerful people on the planet, will be more powerful than ever, end quote. And I think that's a message, or I hope that's a message politicians of all stripes should be able to get behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should also note that this is the same senator who launched a probe into Meta's chatbots' romantic and sensual conversations with minors, which we did report on a previous episode. And just one more quote before we go on, since it's very much what we talk about, which is unfortunately pretty much almost every week. Holly also said, we must add sensible guardrails to the emergent AI economy and hold concentrated economic power to account.
Amen to that. All the power to him in that goal, I'd say. But let's move on to something a little bit lighter. This is Mark Zuckerberg's lawsuit against Mark Zuckerberg. Can you explain that for us, Amber?
Yeah, absolutely. I had to read this story a couple of times because it is so bizarre. Now, apparently there's a bankruptcy lawyer from Indiana named Mark Zuckerberg who uses Facebook for ads, but he had his page repeatedly disabled because the robots at Meta kept thinking that he was trying to impersonate their CEO. In fact, the lawyer had spent more than $11,000 US to advertise on Meta's platforms. That's a significant amount of money, which he still has to pay, even though Meta has disabled his account. And to our point last week when we were discussing stories like this, it is almost impossible to deal with anything that's happening within the Meta ecosystem, especially when it comes to advertising, especially when you want to be able to get through to human support. I am not even convinced, Jeff, that there are humans who work at Meta anymore. I
agree. Yeah.
I don't know what they are doing, but maybe they're wearing their Ray-Ban Meta glasses and in a whole other universe. Now, this lawyer has been fighting this issue since, and we are saying this correctly, so don't be shocked, since 2017. So 8 years now without a permanent resolution.
Yeah, and again, not surprising, not remotely surprising to us, I don't think. And this is the same Meta who, as we cover stuff like this every week, this time, whose teen accounts on Instagram, which were launched in response to accusations that Meta designed its products to make children addicted to them. Its teen accounts on Instagram were recently found by the Tech Transparency Project to still allow children to find violent, inappropriate content, such as, and I'm quoting here, 2 dogs tearing at each other's heads and throats in a dimly lit space while people kick them to encourage them to fight. There are other examples of like schoolyard fights that are being distributed, and lots more content that is just not appropriate for young people. Frankly, probably not appropriate for anyone. But as you might imagine, Meta's response, as unaccountable as always, was that teen accounts were, and again I quote, broadly working as intended, though search results may vary based on the specific queries. And then they noted that, sure, some teen content saw, quote, some teen accounts would see some violating content, and we removed it.
It's just unbelievable and really isn't good enough. We need to do better in all of these spaces. And I think it's just clear once again that most of these tech companies see keeping our kids safe as something that is really unimportant. Now, I recommend that everybody watches Jeff's The Other Max segment from last week. You're getting a lot of comments on this, Jeff, which is all about OpenAI's role in the heartbreaking suicide of a 16-year-old boy. It is such a sad story, and a lot to discuss on that front. So you did a really great job on that segment. Now, let's change gears a little bit and head from the technology world over to science, Jeff.
Excellent. And I think this is a pretty cool story. And I don't know why I'd never thought of this, but a global expedition involving more than a dozen different countries is now underway drilling for fresh water, but you'll never guess where they're drilling for it: underneath the ocean. So there are apparently underwater aquifers that could hold the solution for basically all of humanity's increasing shortage of fresh water. And the UN says the demand for fresh water will exceed the supply of fresh water by 40% in just 5 years. So that is a very short time frame, and frankly, kind of terrifying. And we should note that part of this is because of the exploding resource needs of those data centers, which I talked about in the other Mac, that bring us cloud computing and AI, and how hungry they are for energy, and that includes cooling and resources like water and all this. So they're gobbling up resources at an unprecedented rate, and that's how we get to timelines where we start to worry about water in the near future.
This is absolutely terrifying. And it's important to note as well that more than a quarter of the world's population doesn't have access to safe drinking water. So it will be fascinating to see how this all progresses.
And we should, just being Canadian, let's also put it out there, because this is such a cool fact. Canada has more lakes than every other country in the world combined. Canada has an unbelievable amount of lakes, and we hold 20% of the world's freshwater reserves and 7% of the world's renewable freshwater supply. So, and I've talked to people in the past that what Canada should have invested in were not pipelines for oil necessarily, but pipelines that could be repurposed to use water in the future, because we've got a lot of it, and that's going to be a commodity that is going to be in great demand in the future, as this story shows. Hopefully some alternate supplies there as well. But, ideally, I guess we have to just cross our fingers and hope we don't exhaust that entire supply fighting climate-induced forest fires.
Yes, that is a very, very real situation that we have reported on this show. We had an expert talking about many of these wildfires and the increase in the number of wildfires. It feels like we have blinders on sometimes, Jeff, to what is actually happening in this country. And
yeah, that was an intense interview, Amber. I just that was one of the ones that I watched afterwards and was like, wow, I think everyone should see this, because that guy's like, this made my hair go gray researching this.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, he was sincerely saying that. I kind of laughed when he said it. I felt a little badly afterwards because it was true that it happened, but I could totally understand. Now let's close off with a couple of entertainment stories. First up, I think a lot of people out there probably remember the video game The Sims. Well, it's still kicking, with The Sims 4 recently adding to the adventure with what seems to be a Love Island reality TV show inspired dating competition retreat, all complete with a hot tub.
Yeah, it is very strange. It's come a long way from SimCity, the original one, and obviously The Sims were pretty exciting kind of gaming when it came out, and very unique. But now it has evolved just like the rest of our entertainment. And I tend to agree with one of the greatest actors of our time, Gary Oldman's assessment was that, quote, reality TV to me is the museum of social decay. And couldn't agree more. I've thankfully been exposed to very little Love Island, but I can just imagine what that's going to mean. So I don't know why people have such a hard time living their own lives. But, the stuff like that makes me wonder, what's going to come next? Are we going to have an in-game OnlyFans subscription network pop up there? I don't know. Anyway, The Sims, I'm glad that they keep on going, but that's kind of a questionable evolution for them. But if you want to talk about content that we all should love, here's some good news. Following Trump's cuts to public media in the United States, Sesame Street has inked deals with most recently YouTube and previously Netflix to stream their fantastic children's content to more people than ever. So that's hopefully going to keep that beautiful dream alive a little bit longer, and maybe introduce them to audiences who would never have been exposed to them.
That is great news. You have to love Sesame Street. I think many of us who are our age, we all grew up on that. And if I can name drop a little bit, I do want to say that quite a few years ago, I had a chance with Chris, my partner, to meet Elmo. So that was a big highlight in our career so far. In fact, we had the documentary filmmaker behind Being Elmo on the show a few weeks ago. So that was always a fun chat to speak with him about all things tech. Now, before we move on to the other Mac, just a quick Canadian entertainment public service announcement that the documentary John Candy, I Like Me, has premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival and will drop on Amazon Prime on October 10th. I can't wait. With Colin Hanks directing and Ryan Reynolds producing. I know a lot of people have seen this already because it just premiered at the film festival here in Toronto. You should really check out the trailer on YouTube. It's going to be a good one. I know you're excited.
And a tearjerker. I couldn't make it through it. I couldn't make it through without tearing up a little bit, because John Candy's pretty much a saint relative to my perception of him.
100%. So that's going to be great to watch that coming up in October. Now, coming up here on the show, in light of CEO Elon Musk's new $1 trillion pay package being offered by Tesla, just going to talk about whether society needs a maximum wage almost as much as a minimum wage. That's coming up next in The Other Mac.
The Other Mac.
As you may have heard, Tesla has proposed a nearly $1 trillion compensation package for its CEO, Elon Musk. The plan covers the next 10 years and has a variety of requirements attached to it, but the sheer scale of the package, which is almost as much as Tesla's market cap, is hard to understand. So let's look at some numbers. The average salary for a college graduate in engineering in the United States is now roughly about $80,000 per year. So Musk's yearly compensation under this new package would be equivalent to the salaries of over 1,218,000 of those engineers. Now, the ratio of CEO to average worker pay has been trending upwards for ages. In the 1950s, it was around 20 to 1. In the 1990s, around 100 to 1. And in the United States in 2021, it had risen to almost 400 to 1. Now, 400 to 1 is already a lot, but Musk's compensation is more than 3,000 times that level if we're using those numbers. And while Musk is obviously the richest person in all of history, AI has been creating millionaires overnight, with Meta offering up compensation for new hires for its superintelligence lab that exceed $100 million of compensation in the first year. So this isn't just about uber wealthy founders and investors. But let's look at it another way. The top 5 richest people in the US have a net worth that's equal to the GDP of the entire country of Switzerland, which has the 21st highest GDP in the world. In Forbes' Richest People in America list for 2024, 4 of the top 5 were from the tech industry, with Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, and Oracle's Larry Ellison next after Elon, whose net worth was $244 billion at that point, before dipping out of the tech world with Warren Buffett in 5th place with a net worth of $150 billion. But what's really interesting about the Forbes list is it includes a philanthropy score from 1 to 5, with 5 being for people who have given away 20% or more of their wealth, down to 1 for those who have given away less than 1% of their wealth. And what frankly wasn't very surprising to me is that more than 70% of the billionaires listed scored only a 1 or a 2 in philanthropy. That's fully 280 of the 400 billionaires, with only 10 on the list scoring a 5. In the list of ones who don't seem motivated to give much back despite their enormous wealth, we have the richest man ever, Elon Musk, Oracle's Larry Ellison, Google's Larry Page, NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, and some non-tech paragons of tightness like Rupert Murdoch and many of the Walmart's Walton family. In fact, if you look at the top 25 richest people in America, only Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and Michael Bloomberg score a 4 or 5 for philanthropy. Now, trickle-down economics was always a lie, but it's becoming very frustrating for normal people to see things becoming so expensive to the point where we're increasingly living in very different worlds than our fellow man. And this isn't going to go away. In 2010, there were just over 1,000 billionaires globally, and 15 years later in 2025, the number of billionaires tripled to over 3,000. Meanwhile, the world's population grew by less than 20% over that time. So, 20% more people, but 200% more billionaires is a dangerous accumulation of wealth and no way for a successful society to evolve. So what can be done? Well, politicians in most countries have been unable to figure out how to tax the wealthy appropriately. And a lot of this seems to be based on the fact that they don't want to drive the richest people out of their countries. And in my estimation, the country that could probably do the most towards this is the US, as I don't get the sense that your average wealthy American really wants to move to another country, even as much as they do enjoy their occasional visits to Svenborgia. Unfortunately, a lot of those people seem to be comfortable electing politicians who are entirely unfit for duty, as long as it means that they can make even more money. And while it would be nice to think that they'll be hoisted on their own petard by making their own country demonstrably worse, the problem with very rich people is they can pretty much buy their way out of most problems, and so they don't really suffer the worst effects of their own actions. And I wish I had an answer for all of this, but as the gap between the haves and the have-nots grows dangerously wide, I'd encourage the extremely wealthy to reflect on their privilege, check their entitlement, and spend some time thinking about how they can make the whole world better for everyone. And maybe while they're at it, read a bit about the French Revolution. I'm the other Mac.
The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
You might remember back in July when Alberta's premier said, and I'm quoting here, that pornography is a problem for young adults. Well, that's a totally fair statement, but the response to this problem is to do more to provide guardrails around what these young adults have access to on the internet. Instead, Daniel Smith went after school library books, including graphic novels, with a new policy that was open to interpretation. So much so that one school board found and planned to remove 200 books from its library shelves to comply with the policy, including Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. To unpack this story, Amber spoke to someone who knows a lot about what's happening in Alberta. Rob Breakenridge is a host and columnist at The Line Alberta and a columnist at the Calgary Herald. Here's their conversation.
News matters.
Rob, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, great to be here.
Thank you for talking to us about this book ban in Alberta. We really wanted to have someone on who understands what has been going on inside of the province, especially over the past few weeks. So let's talk a little bit about this book ban. How did it start and evolve to the point where we are today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the past few weeks. I mean, you can go back the past few months, even you could go back the past few years. So there's a few different things at play. One of them is really specifically around books, and certain books in particular. There were a few graphic novels in Alberta that were kind of the center of this. And if you look around in other jurisdictions, particularly in the US, these exact same books have been a source of controversy. So that's part of it. There's a broader issue here too, I think, of what's going on in schools, and are parents aware of what's going on in schools, or aware what their kids might be exposed to? You know, Alberta, like a few other provinces, have gone through this whole debate around like the use of names or pronouns. Like if kids want to use a different pronoun or a different name, should parents be notified? So there's that as kind of a broader context. So basically the short version is, back in the spring, it was brought to the government's attention that a few of these controversial graphic novels had been found in certain Alberta school libraries. So the Alberta government sort of took that as a jumping off point to saying, hey, maybe we need a much broader policy here regarding content in school libraries. And if there's stuff in there that kids shouldn't be seeing or isn't age appropriate, that needs to be dealt with. So they took a few months to come up with this, I guess what we call it, a ministerial order. So the education minister puts out the edict in July to school boards. Okay, here's how it's going to be. Here's the new criteria. You got to get all this material out of schools that we consider to be explicit sexual content. Problem was, the way that was written in the order was easily applicable to all kinds of different books. Like it didn't even specify images, like words, images, audio, video were all considered the same. So the Edmonton Public School Board did their assessment, and they came up with a list of about 200 books that they felt needed to be pulled in order to comply with this order. We learned about that last week, and it just set off this whole firestorm that, well, hang on a second here. Why are schools banning, you know, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, or even the book Atlas Shrugged, which Danielle Smith herself has identified as a personal favorite? So it really prompted this whole debate around, well, what is explicit sexual content? What should be in schools? And did the Alberta government screw this up? Was this the Edmonton Public School Board kind of thumbing their nose at government policy? So that's kind of how we got here.
I think what it has been really interesting about this story, especially over the past few days, is that there's a bit of a blame game going on. So I think what we've seen is that when it comes to the school board in Edmonton, they were really just trying to do their best based on the fact that the order, like you have said, didn't have a lot of details in it. And also the school board only had a few more weeks to comply to this order. When Margaret Atwood got involved, I would argue that has been kind of a tipping point insofar as the media paying attention to the situation. Can you talk a little bit about what took place then?
Yeah, I mean, Margaret Atwood speaking out about this, you had international coverage. I mean, the BBC was covering this, other American media outlets. So sort of that international spotlight. And I think even too, just the idea, I mean, Danielle Smith holds herself up as kind of a libertarian. So the idea that this libertarian premier is implementing maybe the most sweeping book ban we've ever seen in Alberta or even in this country. I think they bristled at that criticism. So part of it then was lashing out at the Edmonton Public School Board. And again, I don't think the board did anything wrong here. I don't think anyone who has criticized the school board has been able to go back and say, well, this book shouldn't have been pulled or that book shouldn't have been pulled, because again, is under the definition of what is explicit sexual content. There are passages in all of these books that meet that definition. So the problem for the Alberta or the Edmonton Public School Board is, well, down the road, if they say, well, we'll just leave that book there, they probably didn't mean that book, then maybe you get criticized down the road. Well, that book shouldn't be on the shelf. Why is it? So they were going to get criticized either way. And I think the Alberta government realized that maybe they screwed this up without admitting it. They said, okay, we're going to pause this. We're going to clarify the criteria, the definition, and we're still waiting to see that. But the premier's emphasized a few times in her comments we want it to be about graphic images, and like I say, this initial order didn't distinguish between words and images.
Let's talk a little bit more about the order. I was reading a story that you had written about this, an opinion piece in the Calgary Herald. And from what I do understand, when we look at this order, one of the things that really surprised me is that it wasn't specific to certain grades. Is that correct?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, there were different categories. So the category that was referred to as explicit sexual content, that needed to be gone, period, from all schools, all grades, could not be in any schools at all. There was a separate category that was referred to as non-explicit sexual content. And this would be the sort of stuff that maybe could be there in high schools, but probably shouldn't be there in junior high or middle school or elementary schools. But the problem, again, with the explicit sexual content definition is just how sweeping it was. So we get all of these books that maybe should be like in high schools, like The Handmaid's Tale as an example, that met that criteria and had to be pulled all together. So I think the Alberta government initially was trying to draw that distinction, but just kind of the clumsy way they went about it led to this whole situation here.
What do you think about the premier's reaction? I saw even as recently as today some posts online where she had said, if the Edmonton Public School Board needs us to go through the books one by one, we can help them do that. Is this really the government's role to do something like that?
Well, I mean, it could be. That's the whole thing. If the Alberta government wants to be the ones to come up with a list and hand it to school board and say, here, these are the books that need to go, they could do that. But they chose not to. Instead, again, they came up with, here's the definition. So go through your libraries. Again, I mean, look, these are thousands of books in school libraries or even materials that are just in classrooms. Go through all of it. Here's the definition, go through your materials and your books. And if any of those meet that definition, then they got to go. So that's what the Alberta government did here. Again, I'm not sure the idea that the Edmonton Public School Board should have said, okay, this book meets that definition, but they probably don't want it banned. We'll just leave it there. And I'm sure the education minister didn't want 100 different phone calls. Well, what about this book? What about that book? Again, it's all spelled out in the definition. I don't want to get into all the details, but it is spelled out as to what constitutes explicit sexual content. And, in the piece that I wrote, I used the example of Atlas Shrugged because of the fact that Danielle Smith has said that it's a favorite of hers. In fact, she even said the other day, maybe it should be mandatory reading in high schools. Like it can't be both ways. There are passages in Atlas Shrugged that are, sexual in nature, and the way it's described, these encounters in the book between the main character and some of her lovers, that it would meet this definition. So the idea that it's explicit and it should be banned, but it's also valuable and should be mandatory reading, like it can't be both, right? So yeah, the premier's been on the defensive, but I think ultimately that's partly because governments don't like to acknowledge that they screwed up. And I think in this case, the Alberta government screwed up.
I think one of the things that really interests me is because we are first and foremost a technology show. And so we report a lot on how children use technology, especially when it comes to some of the big tech companies that exist out there. Just recently, we did a segment on ChatGPT in the case where there's a family who is suing OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, because their 16-year-old son committed suicide. ChatGPT in many ways acted almost like a mentor through this process, which went on for weeks weeks and weeks. I mean, just devastating to read that. I've been reporting on online safety for kids for many, many years. And so one of the things that really strikes me as sort of bizarre about this story is that in this age of digital access, where most kids are handed a smartphone when they're still in elementary school, and we live in a country where there aren't any specific rules in terms of keeping kids safe from online harms, it seems so unusual to me that we have gone to banning individual books. I mean, we're lucky if kids even read.
Well, yeah, no kidding. And it was funny because as I was kind of debating this on Twitter and elsewhere, someone said to me, like, hang on a second here. There's a reason why Penthouse magazine is way on the back shelf. And I kind of laughed, like, you think young people today even know what that is, or the idea of a magazine? That seems so bizarre. And it shows how outdated maybe a lot of us are approaching this, the way we're thinking about this. Because, yeah, you're right. Kids are walking around with these phones where they have almost instantaneous access, if they want it, to what we would refer to as pornography. And even now with what's going on with AI and certain versions of AI and what AI can create, it's just, it's really troubling, the potential here. And so if we're worried about what kids are having access to, it seems weird that we're parsing paragraphs in a Margaret Atwood book versus what are kids accessing on their phones? How much access do they have to stuff that they should definitely not be seeing? That seems like a much bigger issue, a much bigger challenge for us right now.
In some ways, it seems like an easier battle, right? It's much easier to ban a few books than it is to deal with this issue of online harms and kids on the internet. You've been covering politics for a really long time. When you think about perhaps the battle that should be had as far as online safety and kids, I mean, are we fooling ourselves by just getting distracted by all of these other mechanisms, whether it's talking about pronouns or talking about banning books, when the real issue, and we see this in all of the data when it comes to issues with anxiety and depression, we see that the internet is first and foremost to blame for many of those issues.
Yeah. And I mean, sure, there's politics at play here, right? I mean, there's these groups that want these books banned. And I think it's helpful for, conservative governments like we have in Alberta to not anger those groups and keep them on side. And there's other issues that come into play about, the perception that teachers are left wing, or they're trying to put ideas in your kid's head that you don't want. And so all of that comes into play in these debates. But it is a bit of a distraction, I think you're right, from the whole question of the well-being of young people and what kids are being exposed to, not just in terms of accessing adult content, but the way in which they're interacting with each other, the sorts of bullying that take place, the way in which social media algorithms are manipulating them and how they think about themselves and how they interact with the world, the idea of just going out and hanging out with friends. And, it's kind of turned childhood on its head in a lot of ways. And so you're right. I think if we're focused on books in a library, we're kind of missing the boat. I think the kids probably aren't going to libraries in the first place. We could get them there. I think that would be a positive, and then we could worry about the books after that. But no, you're right. I think they're on their devices. They're not spending a lot of time scouring the shelves of the school library hoping to find something racy.
Yeah, when I was reading all of these different posts and watching all of the news stories on this issue, I thought to myself for a second, this could have been something that happened maybe in 1990, right? Like if you were just to pull this out and plant it directly in 1990 and say the Premier of Alberta and her government are banning books, they're pulling books from shelves. Margaret Atwood is complaining about what's taking place because one of her classics is being banned. And I thought, what do we do in our society today when we have 2025 problems in front of us, but we're still arguing for issues that are decades old?
Yeah, and I remember that. I think, in high school, we read Catcher in the Rye. And at the time, I remember maybe that shouldn't be for kids. And, that's maybe too racy or adult in some ways. And so it feels like we've been debating this for, generations almost, but we're at a point now where, as you say, technology has changed, the whole conversation dramatically about, how kids are growing up, what they're being exposed to, as we say, how they're interacting with one another and the kinds of pressures they're facing. So I think a conversation about the well-being of children that's happening in 2025 needs to be a conversation that reflects all the realities of being a kid in 2025.
You're a podcaster. You also work for a mainstream media outlet. So certainly you've seen many of the culture wars that are unfolding on the internet. And when this story broke, especially over the past week, I think one of the things that I really started to notice was how people were weaponizing this news for whatever side that they might be on. I mean, I saw this all over Instagram. People were standing and holding copies of the books that had been banned to try to gain support. And, you see it again with the Alberta government as well. And so the story that unfolds online also, I think, impacts what ends up happening in the real world.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of, delicate issues that are maybe a little more current today. Like, when I was in school, no one really talked about sexuality or gender, like sexual orientation or gender identity, or the idea that there would be gay straight alliances in school. Like, none of that existed. So a lot of this is more modern. And I think to parents today, it's kind of unknown and it's kind of scary. And so once you get into this whole debate around, okay, are things happening at school that are being kept secret from me as a parent, or that I don't know about, or I don't fully understand, parents can get nervous and apprehensive. And so I do think, governments see an opportunity at times to say, okay, well, parents are nervous. We'll be the champions of these parents. We're going to say, hey, we're on your side in this. And that can be politically powerful. And so I think that affects a lot of these debates. These are politicians that are elected to govern. So they're inherently going to be political in a lot of ways in how they operate. They want to win elections and keep getting reelected. So it's impossible probably to separate the politics from it all, but it does complicate things. And these are tricky issues. Like, what do you do in schools where you've got kids that are unsure about their sexuality or their gender, and maybe they want to experiment, or maybe they're going in a certain direction and they're more comfortable being called a different name. Like, how do schools manage all of that? There are no easy answers here, but these issues do get politicized, and then accusations start flying, like, the government's trying to out kids, and the government doesn't care about gay or transgendered kids, or, teachers are indoctrinating kids and they don't care about parents or parental rights. Like, it can get pretty heated.
And it does kind of feel, and again, if I go back to the fact that you have covered politics for a really long time, it does feel like in some ways we're importing some of these political conversations that are having been had in the US, right?
Yep.
I see that in the US all the time. I mean, we see the book bans, and of course that is replicated here in Canada. We see these same sort of culture wars that are coming into our country. But in some ways, and I mean, if we zoom out from Alberta, it does appear to me that we're just a different country entirely.
Well, we are. And I mean, there are some similarities. It is interesting, as I alluded to at the outset, like one of these graphic novels that was at the source of the controversy in Alberta, it's called Genderqueer. And it's a memoir, but it's a graphic novel. And you can look in certain U.S. states where this book was at the flashpoint of some huge controversies. And in particular, in the state of Virginia, in 2021, it kind of swung the governor's race to the Republicans because it became such a flashpoint. So I do think you had groups in Canada saying, okay, well, this played out in our favor in the US. Maybe, if we look around and we snoop around, and maybe there's some libraries in Canada where you can find this book, and maybe we can turn it into an issue here and try to galvanize people in a similar way. So yeah, I think some of that is importing US politics and US strategies. But again, this whole question of, what is in my kid's school's library? What might they be exposed to? What is appropriate for an 8-year-old versus a 17-year-old? Like, I think there are realistic and relative and reasonable conversations that can be had along those lines. But when people are doing it to advance a culture war and, to drive political wedges, I don't think that's helpful. And I don't think ultimately that benefits kids.
I think also when we talk about kids, I think one of the things I see more and more, and again, I don't want to call out any specific politician, but I do think that kids kind of get caught in the crosshairs a lot these days when it comes to some of these culture wars that are taking place, right? And they already have enough to worry about. The last thing they really need is to be brought into all of these daily feuds that adults are having online. And yet, and again, if I kind of zoom out from the fact that we have bigger issues that we need to be talking about, whether it's climate or big tech or our energy transition, whatever it might be, time and time again, kids are getting drawn into these conversations and not really having a voice at the table in the process.
Yeah, it's true. And I think ultimately it stems from a good place. Like, I think we all want what's best for our kids, and that's a good impulse to have, but it's powerful too, politically powerful. There's an old classic joke from The Simpsons, right? Where one of the characters says, "Won't somebody please think of the children?" And how can you object to that? Well, one side says we're on the side of kids. We're in favor of kids. Well, there's no rebuttal to that. It's like a way of shutting down arguments almost because, well, yeah, everyone wants what's best for kids. So yeah, that's a good impulse to have. And I think at times that can lead to productive conversations. In Alberta, and as with other provinces, there's been a real robust conversation around maybe we shouldn't allow cell phones in class. Now, that doesn't change the access that kids have outside of class. But if it's a distraction in school, maybe it makes sense that they leave the cell phone at home or in the locker, or they check it somehow at the start of the day. I think that's been less political because it doesn't have those same kind of culture war issues. And again, I think that's a case where the impulse is what's best for kids, and maybe that can lead to a smarter regulation of something or better policy of something. So I think that can sometimes take us to good places. At times, I think it takes us to issues that become too political and aren't really, I think, in the best interest of kids at the end of the day. And I think this whole controversy in Alberta is maybe an example of that, and perhaps a lesson for other jurisdictions to learn from.
It's interesting you bring up cell phones in schools, because I do think that is one of those policies. And we've seen it over the past couple of years where more and more provinces are really locking down on this idea where phones need to be kept away during the school day or not brought to school altogether. And I think you're right. You have unanimous support for those types of policies. Yeah. Those types of policies make sense. I would also argue we would see the same thing in terms of online harms and trying to regulate some of the social media giants that are in our country today. Getting back to the book ban specifically, do you think this is even going to be on our radar in a few weeks? Like, did it make a blip in terms of a conversation that we're going to continue to have?
Well, I don't know. It remains to be seen. I do think partly here in Alberta, we got a whole situation where teachers are on the verge of either going on strike or being locked out. And if that happens, well, that's all anyone's going to be thinking about and talking about if schools are shut down because of a labor dispute. So that would push the whole book ban to the back burner. I do wonder, though, if other provinces are kind of watching all of this. Originally it started with one province, the whole issue of gender pronouns and names, and then other provinces picked up on that. So I do wonder if maybe other provincial governments were kind of watching what was happening in Alberta to see what Alberta did and what the reaction was. So I do wonder, because Alberta's government was so stung by the pushback, maybe other provinces are like, we don't want to touch that. And maybe that's all that happens here. But yeah, ultimately, I think that'll be the test as to whether this is a lasting issue, whether other provinces take up the mantle and say, yeah, we need to clean up our school libraries. We need to get the filth out of libraries, or can cut another way. I mean, there was a controversy in Ontario a couple of years ago where they were removing what they considered to be outdated books from libraries, and maybe more that impulse from the left, like these books are a little insensitive when it comes to race, and we don't want kids exposed to that sort of thing. And it's coming from a different side of the political spectrum, but it's kind of the same, right? Like we got to protect the kids from this bad stuff. So it's come up before, maybe it'll come up again. I guess we'll see how other provinces choose to deal with it.
Do you have a lot of librarians in schools in Alberta? Because that is one role that I've seen here in Ontario, that increasingly when we have budget cuts, those people tend to get cut first.
Yeah, and that's been an issue here too. I think they've certainly been challenged on that side, but it is still a position that exists. And it's funny because in this whole debate, it's almost like they're forgotten. Like we just sort of think, okay, there's that room full of books and kids just wander in and take what they want. Like you do have schools in Alberta, as you do elsewhere, that are like kindergarten through grade 9 or kindergarten through grade 12. And when you've got a situation where you've got a school with 6-year-olds and 16-year-olds, you've got to be diligent in how all of these resources are managed. And that's kind of what school librarians are trained to do. So we do sort of forget that they're there, they exist. It's not this kind of free-for-all maybe that people are imagining when it comes to access to certain kinds of content. So it is important, I think, to have those experts that make these decisions, that are reviewing materials, that understand what's age appropriate and how to guide kids. And so they, it's funny because they play an important role, but I think they've been kind of forgotten in this whole conversation.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think at some point too, we have to trust those people to help to make those decisions. I mean, they're going to know best. And like we've said a number of times, I think many of us would be really excited if we knew kids wanted to flock to the library and
Sure.
read
Yeah,
books in the
exactly.
first place. And yes, I think once they get there, maybe we can have that conversation about what's allowed and what's not allowed. And I think use common sense throughout that whole process. I mean, this isn't really a difficult thing, I think, to be able to achieve, especially with those people like librarians who are part of that conversation. Before I let you go, I had mentioned that you are a podcaster. You also write a column. Tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, we got the Rob Breakenridge show, which I do. You can find that at robbreakenridge.ca. I also work with The Line and the new podcast, The Line Alberta. So alberta.readtheline.ca, an Alberta focused podcast. Comes out every Wednesday. I also write for the Calgary Herald as well, calgaryherald.com. So busy guy, I guess, which is good. Yeah.
Is there anything that those of us in Ontario should know about what's happening in Alberta that maybe we get wrong sometimes?
Well, it seems to be a lot happening in Alberta these days. Yeah, I think Alberta is unique in some respects in terms of much of the political debate. I think people probably noticed that there's a lot of focus right now on Ottawa's place or Alberta's place in Confederation, our relationship with Ottawa, and just sort of how folks are feeling in the aftermath of a federal election where Alberta voted one way, the rest of the country voted another way. So that's kind of unique to Alberta, and that's probably a bigger issue than books in libraries. So, but I think again, some of these issues around books in schools and the relationship between teachers and kids and teachers and parents, those are not specific at all, or not unique to Alberta at all. And so I think that's relevant here, but I would imagine that's relevant right across the country.
Yeah, and we should also say that, book bans have been around since the beginning of time, right? This is, again, something that is not new. I think nobody really wants to see it. We want people to read as much as possible, but this certainly is a conversation that has pretty deep roots as well. So I'm sure we'll hear more about this. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today on the show.
Yeah, that was fun. Thanks for having me.
We should add that earlier this week, the Alberta government planned to update its book ban order to target books that contain sexual images, not all books with images, audio, and written passages with sexually explicit content. We'll see how that ministerial order pans out in the weeks ahead. But speaking of the next generation, when we come back, we'll share more on an industry with an aging workforce that is recruiting new workers across the country.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
Based on recent numbers, youth unemployment is on the rise. Young adults are struggling to find work. Amber spoke to Joanne Sally, President and CEO at Teachers on Call on This Is Mining the podcast to learn about opportunities that start deep underground. Here's a sneak peek of their conversation.
Welcome back to This Is Mining the podcast, where we explore the unexpected ways people discover a connection to Ontario's mining industry and how those moments can shape the future. Today's guest is a perfect example of how one experience can change everything. Joanne Sally is the president and CEO of Teachers on Call, an award-winning tutoring service with deep roots in Ontario's education system.
What advice do you have for parents? Like I mentioned, we're both moms and we want to be able to guide young people in terms of the opportunities for the future. You talked a little bit about starting those conversations. When you think about actually trying to kind of demystify mining for the next generation, what are some other things that parents can do? Because not everybody's going to have a chance to go into a mine like we have. So what can be done?
That's a great question. And it's not an easy question. And I'm sure many others have asked that as well. I think, again, it's back to exposure. I think it's just about even talking about mining. I mean, I don't think that it's part of many dinner time conversations right now or part of, YouTube breaks, when you're or taking a walk with your kids. I think that it's just finding ways to bring many different careers to the table, untraditional. I feel that a lot of times as parents, we're not necessarily talking about careers of the future. We talk about the careers that are very easy for our kids to understand, whether it's like teaching or medicine or law. But truthfully, if you look at careers of the future, so many of the jobs that our children are going to be looking at, they don't even exist today. So I think that talking about mining is important, showing them the video, but certainly there's a lot of great books. And I think looking at children's books, I've discovered a lot of amazing books, whether it's about rocks, whether it's about mining. There's this great book, Anna's Adventures in the Mines, that I was showing to my son that was, I thought, really interesting. I think it's just about being creative and finding different ways that are age appropriate to talk to your children. If you have a younger child like mine, it might be as simple as starting with rocks, right? Like rocks might be simple. Maybe in your case with a high school student, depending on what his interests are, relating back, to his interests. I don't think there's a one size fits all solution, but I think the fact that if it's even on our radar, we can be a little bit more creative about how to talk to our children about many different careers that are maybe not the normal traditional ones at our fingertips.
You make a really good point, because I think a lot of that involves, as parents, meeting our kids where they're at. So with my son being a little bit older and being interested in things like geopolitics, all of a sudden there's a really great opportunity to talk about mining when it comes to critical minerals, because that's all you're going to see in terms of what's coming out in conversations from world leaders who are meeting together. And Canada has such a unique role to play there. So kind of meeting the kids where they're at. You understand this very well. Your business helps families really dream bigger. When you think about mining, how has that helped to really expand your own imagination of what's possible?
You have great questions, Amber. I think that mining represents like all of these possibilities. And our mission at Teachers on Call is to really support students on their academic journey so they can be successful in any subject that they're struggling with or they want to excel in, or anything in between. And by equipping students with the skills to master those subjects, that will help them be successful in the college or university program of their choice. And my hope is that, through our company, through tutoring, we can also not only be part of their academic journey, but open up different career possibilities. And certainly now there's so much youth unemployment, that's a big headline in the news today. I look to mining as this amazing industry that has so many opportunities for our youth, so many jobs. And so my hope is, through a company like mine and tutoring, that we can prepare students really for the future of work and also open their eyes to the amazing opportunities that careers like mining can offer them that maybe aren't on their radar, opportunities that have incredible flexibility, really strong compensation, and as I said, a lot of jobs.
Thanks so much, Joanne. And thanks to all of you for listening to today's episode. We've got lots of comments from last week's show about AI safety and security, so if you haven't listened, it's a good one. If you missed it, you can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
You can also find video versions of our segments over on YouTube at Amber Mac. And if you're listening on SiriusXM Canada Talks, thank you so much for joining us each week. Stay safe out there, online and offline, and we'll see you soon.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.